We've talked for a long time about the skeleton, bones of the upper limb, bones of the lower limb, joints, points of articulation between two bones or three bones. The knee joint that we just saw was a joint where three bones articulated. Well, that should make sense. Three bones articulated. Femur, tibia, and patella. And we described a lot of the associated musculature. So the muscles that span a joint move that joint. Muscles only shorten, they contract, they are activated, they pull bones across a joint and act to shorten or contract to move the joint. But we've not really thought about what a muscle is, what makes up a muscle, and what gives it that ability to contract. And that's what we're going to discuss in this section. What are the characteristics of muscle that give it that functionality? So far, a muscle is just an elastic band to us. It's connected in two places. When it contracts, it pulls those ends together. What is it about the muscle that allows it to do that? So in this chapter, we're going to talk first about the structure of muscle. Three different types of muscle, but we are going to focus on one of them primarily. The other two you will see in HKIN 152. We're going to focus in depth on one type of muscle because we've been talking about one type of muscle up until this point. When we know the ingredients or the structure of muscle, we're then going to see how those get turned on. What happens at the neuromuscular junction to take a signal from the brain and translate that into motion or force. Force then makes motion. What happens to send a signal to generate tension, to turn on the machinery that pulls the ends of a muscle together? We'll look at that in detail. That entire process requires energy. You fidgeting in your seats right now, there's muscles contracting, that requires energy. Not very much because you're not generating a lot of force, you're not moving many muscles. The more muscles you move and the more forcefully you move them, the more energy you need. So we need to figure out how that energy is provided. It's a fun little tidbit. If you didn't have the ability to provide energy in the muscle, you would run out in 5 seconds. You would run out of the ability to contract the muscle in 5 seconds. You'd experience what's called rigor. And you probably heard it as rigor mortis when you die. The stiffness in the muscles when you die. The stiffness occurs because there's no energy available to reset the muscles. We're going to learn all about that process in figuring out how the muscles use energy. And the overall goal is to use that energy to do work. The muscle cell generates tension, and tension will accomplish work at the joint. Tension within the muscle cell is what we care about at this level. Tension is pulling two ends of the muscle cell together. If you do that enough and you line up enough muscle cells, you can get full contraction of a biceps brachii, for instance. Tension at the cellular level is what is being accomplished in the muscle. And unsurprisingly, tension isn't fixed. Tension changes. It's higher in some states than others. And so there are a lot of new elements that we're going to introduce, but we'll bring in some old favorites. Elements of the neuromuscular junction, parallel action potentials and synapses. The ability to recruit a muscle requires that you understand summation. The ability to build tension depends heavily on summation. So all of those elements will come back into play as we get through this section. Let's talk about muscle. What does it do? The first idea that comes to mind when you think of muscle is movement. And you're right. The majority of muscles, by volume, by mass, most of the muscles in the body produce movement. And that movement could be my jaw as I speak, some muscles in the vocal cords, leg muscles as I pace. That's locomotion as we think about it, movement. Stabilizing body postures, helping me stay upright. But there are other forms of movements as well. My intestines are moving right now. My intestines are moving, they're squishing up the food that I ate this morning, they're trying to move it along through the digestive system. It's not locomotion like you would classically think about it, but it is motion, it's movement. It requires muscular activity. What other areas are moving? Glands are moving in a slightly somewhat different way. Other muscle tissue is active and moving. The muscles in my arteries have tension. They're opening and closing. They're allowing blood to go to different places as I need blood to go to those places. Sphincters are opening, well, hopefully not opening. Sphincters are closing and staying closed, thank goodness. It'd be really embarrassing to have them opening and closing right now. So, muscle produces movement or maintains tension, maintains force. We are often going to think about it as locomotion, as movement, as articulating a joint. It accomplishes that by having some other characteristics as well. Muscle stores energy. It stores energy, it consumes energy, it's the highest consumer of energy in the body. Or it has the greatest capacity to change its energy consumption. Metabolism can ramp up 200-fold in some cases. We don't think of this, and this is a fairly new concept, but it also has some endocrine function. An endocrine function, I don't expect you to know what that is yet, but it can release molecules that signal other parts of the body. What I'm describing is a hormone-like action. Hormones like testosterone or estrogen, they send signals between tissues of the body. And muscle isn't classically thought of in that sense. It's not a gland. It doesn't release hormones in the classic sense. Maybe in the past 5 or 10 years, we've started realizing some of the benefits of exercise. The reason exercise is so good for you, not only because it uses energy that you have stored in adipose tissue around the body, but it also provides endocrine function. It sends signals to the brain and to the heart saying, hey, I'm being healthy. Do something good. Adapt somehow in a way that benefits the body. Releases molecules that signal the rest of the body. It's also the reason why we are warm-blooded. Muscle generates heat. Muscle generates heat. It generates a lot of heat. About 80% of the energy the muscle consumes is wasted as heat. That's the vast majority of energy being consumed right now that is released as heat. It's just wasted. Only 20% goes towards movement, which seems really inefficient when you think about it, right? The spin there is that it's really good for weight loss. you're wasting a lot of energy. You're wasting it as heat. Only a little bit goes towards motion. But muscles generating heat is the reason why we are warm-blooded. That's our intrinsic source of heat. Otherwise, we'd need to get it from somewhere else. Think of a lizard warming itself on a rock. Radiant heat from the rock, radiant heat from the sun. We don't need to do that. And all of the above are accomplished by muscles' unique ability to contract. Muscle generates tension and it contracts. Muscle squishes, it shortens. That takes energy. It produces heat. It produces molecules that get sent out. As muscle contracts, its shape changes. It generates force. And it can move different parts of the body in relation to other parts of the body. So muscle has this unique ability to contract and shorten and generate force. It's excitable. We can turn it on and off. We can do it voluntarily, and we can do it involuntarily. It's really fascinating tissue. So let's distinguish, separate categories of muscle. When I say muscle, I always think of skeletal muscle, but that's only one type. Let's identify the types of muscular tissue before we move on to exploring one in depth. There are three types of muscular tissue. Three types of muscular tissue. Skeletal muscle, which is what I default to thinking of, and maybe you do as well. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that's attached to the skeleton, that moves the skeleton. Cardiac muscle is specifically located in the heart. Cardiac, heart muscle. And smooth muscle, the muscle that is active in the digestive system, active in the arteries and veins, that we generally don't have control over. Smooth muscle is also typically involuntary. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle are the three types of muscle. I'll give you a brief few bullet points on each one, and then we're going to throw two of them away. So skeletal muscle, my favorite. And if it's my favorite, it should be your favorite, at least for this section. If it's not your favorite, don't tell anyone. Skeletal muscle moves the bones of the skeleton. It's attached to the skeleton via tendons. We have voluntary control over it. And it's what you might call striated. We have voluntary control over it. There are some structures that have involuntary control as well. For instance, the diaphragm is skeletal muscle. The diaphragm, one of the main muscles of breathing. You have voluntary control over the diaphragm. As you take a breath in, the diaphragm drops. But while you're sitting there, or at least until I mentioned it, you weren't thinking about breathing. And the diaphragm was still active. It was controlled involuntarily. Some skeletal muscles have both forms of control. Most, all of them, are voluntarily controlled. You choose to do a biceps curl. You choose to walk out of class when it's boring. Striated simply means striped, like a zebra. Skeletal muscle is striated, and you can see that in this top image on the left and right hand sides. There are waves of these ordered bands that can easily distinguish skeletal muscle from other types of muscle. Striated or striped. It's the only form of muscle that is multinucleated, which simply means in development, a number of smaller muscle fiber cells merge together They merge together, and then the nuclei of those multiple cells now inhabit one larger cell. So you can see multiple dark staining spots on the top as well. Those are multiple nuclei that have the DNA required to make proteins for these muscles to allow them to continue to contract. So striated and multinucleated, we have voluntary control over skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle. Similar in a sense, only located in the heart. It's only located in the heart, and it's only under involuntary control. You can't think and contract your heart more forcefully or faster. Although sometimes when you're stressed, it feels like it is. It feels like you can control it. You can actually, if you take a really deep breath, your heart does speed up a little bit. And if you let that breath out, it does slow down. That's not you controlling your heart muscle. That's a secondary effect of the pressure inside your rib cage. So heart muscle, only involuntary. It's only in the heart. Its sole purpose is to squeeze blood out of the heart and then pump it to the rest of the body. Heart muscle is also striated. So it also has this accordion-like activity or action, ability to lengthen and shorten, to lengthen and contract. But it's arranged in a much different way than skeletal muscle. So they're both striated, but cardiac muscle has these branches. It's not linear like skeletal muscle is. There's all these branches that travel out in different directions. And the reason for that is the heart isn't linear. Right? You think about biceps. You need to bring 2 points closer together. If you have a straight line of elastic between those 2 points, you'll accomplish your goal. The heart doesn't have 2 points that it needs to bring together. A linear muscle won't cut it. What you need to do at the heart is squeeze in all directions. That's why there's all these branches that venture out and end up wrapping around the heart proper. So you don't get 2 points contracting together, you get a muscle that squeezes a large ball that becomes smaller. So that's one clear difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. The other clear difference, which isn't clear on this slide, so I'm going to bring up another picture for you, is that heart muscle, cardiac muscle, is what's called intercalated. That is, it contains intercalated discs. And that word doesn't mean anything to you as I just repeat it over and over again. The intercalated disc is simply a point that connects two heart muscle cells that contains gap junctions. It's the name of the type of connection between two cardiac muscle cells. An intercalated disc connects two heart muscle cells together, and it allows those cells to communicate. Remember, gap junctions were holes in the membrane. Ions could pass through, different substances might be able to pass through depending on how big the hole is, and it connected the insides of two neighboring cells. You really want to do that in the heart. It's really important that action potentials spread everywhere through all of the cells of the heart and not just to a couple different locations. You'll see that in 152. Gap junctions allow that to occur. Action potentials will spread from one cell to the other through the gap junctions in the intercalated discs. Lastly, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle looks smooth. Smooth muscle is not striated. Smooth muscle has no organized bands, no regular repeating pattern. It looks smooth. This muscle is in the skin, the airways, the bronchioles that allow air in and out, the arteries and veins that allow them to open and close, the digestive system, all of those major organ systems that are automatically controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We don't know a lot about their structure and function yet. We haven't talked about the airways. We haven't talked about arteries and veins. That's coming up in 152 as well. So this is a preface. That's a little bit of a foreshadowing. This is the intrinsic muscle of those involuntarily controlled tissues. There's no striations, there's no ordered bands, because the contractile fibers span out in many directions inside the cell. The cells don't just bring 2 points together. They can contract in any number of directions. Some of them are in circular directions. And with all of that detailed explanation, we won't touch on the last two again. The rest of our time spent in this section is on skeletal muscle only. We're looking at the wrappings of skeletal muscle, the structures in skeletal muscle, the proteins, the contractile apparatus. All of that is coming up next week. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, it was a brief introductory primer. Keep that in your back pocket until next semester.